If you told me a few years ago that I'd end up trapping an entire neighborhood's worth of vehicles behind livestock fencing, I probably would have laughed and gone back to feeding cattle. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for fights. Never have been. I've spent most of my life on the same piece of land outside a little farming town in eastern Oklahoma, a place called Red Creek. 41 acres of pasture, a weathered barn my father helped me build, and enough open space that on some mornings all you hear is wind moving through the grass and cattle shifting their weight before sunrise. That's the kind of life I like. Quiet, predictable, honest, which is probably why what happened still sticks with me. It started the weekend I drove down to Tulsa for a livestock auction. Nothing unusual about it. I left on a Friday morning, checked the water tanks, made sure my ranch hand Curtis knew the feeding schedule, and headed out. 2 days. That was all I was gone. 2 days. When I came back Sunday afternoon, I honestly thought I'd missed my turn somewhere. The southern section of my pasture looked completely different. At first I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then it hit me. There was a fence where no fence had ever been before. Not an old ranch fence. Not barbed wire. Not anything that belonged on agricultural land. This thing was bright white vinyl, spotless, perfectly straight, looking like it had been copied and pasted out of a suburban brochure. I slowed my truck and stared. The fence stretched across my pasture as far as I could see. Every 20 feet, there were signs attached to it. Private community property. Residents only. No trespassing. I remember sitting there with my engine idling, looking at those signs and thinking, you've got to be kidding me. The community behind my ranch was called Silver Hollow Estates. It hadn't even existed 5 years earlier. Before developers showed up, it was nothing but scrub brush and abandoned grazing land. Then came the gates, the decorative stone entrance, the matching mailboxes, the homeowners association meetings, the endless rules about paint colors and lawn decorations. We had never been close neighbors, but we'd stayed out of each other's way. At least I thought we had. I parked and walked the fence line myself. The farther I went, the worse it got. Whoever installed it hadn't accidentally crossed the property line by a foot or two. They'd moved deep into my pasture. I already knew something was wrong before I pulled the survey maps from my truck. When I measured it later, the fence sat roughly 120 feet inside my property. 120 feet. You don't make that mistake by accident. Then I found the letter. Somebody had tucked it into my mailbox while I was gone. It was signed by the Silver Hollow HOA board. The language was polite, almost cheerful, which somehow made it more insulting. According to them, the area they fenced off appeared to be in used buffer land. They claimed extending the community boundary would improve safety, increase property values, and create a more attractive transition area between the neighborhood and surrounding properties. They didn't ask permission. They didn't request an easement. They didn't even acknowledge they were standing on someone else's land. They simply informed me that they'd done it. I must have read that letter 3 times before folding it back up. Not because I was confused, because I was trying very hard not to lose my temper. Curtis showed up about 20 minutes later. He took one look at the fence and said, "Well, that's new." I handed him the letter. He read it, looked at me, then looked at the fence again. "You gonna call a lawyer?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But first I want to understand exactly what they did." We spent the rest of the afternoon driving the boundary. That's when we found the part that changed everything. Hidden behind the fence was a gravel overflow parking lot. Freshly installed. Dozens of vehicles were parked there. Pickup trucks, SUVs, sedans, all lined up in neat little rows. At first that seemed strange enough. Then I noticed how they were getting in and out. My stomach actually dropped when I realized it. The only access road feeding that parking area wasn't theirs. It was mine. Years earlier I'd built a dirt service lane through that section of pasture so hay trucks and equipment could reach the back fields. Silver Hollow had quietly started using it. Maybe for months. Maybe longer. They hadn't just taken a chunk of my pasture. They had built an entire parking operation around infrastructure that belonged to me. Curtis started laughing. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes things get so ridiculous that's the only reaction left. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" he asked. I nodded. And for the first time since arriving home, I felt my anger start turning into something else. Something calmer. More focused. Because suddenly I understood something the HOA board clearly didn't. They thought they had control of that land now. They thought once the fence went up, the argument was over. What they didn't realize was every single vehicle in that lot depended on access that crossed my property. And that access was about to become a very expensive lesson. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I walked into my equipment barn, looked at the stack of steel livestock panels leaning against the wall, and started putting together a plan. Most people think revenge happens in a burst of anger. In my experience, the most effective kind happens when you're completely calm. That's how Monday morning started. No yelling, no phone calls, no dramatic confrontation. Just coffee, a legal survey spread across my kitchen table, and a growing certainty that the folks running Silver Hollow Estates had made one of the dumbest decisions I'd ever seen. By 7 o'clock, Curtis was backing the skid steer out of the barn while I loaded steel livestock panels onto a flatbed trailer. If you've never seen livestock panels, they're basically portable fencing used to control cattle. Strong, simple, and surprisingly effective. We hauled them down to the access road and got to work. Every entrance, every exit, every possible route a vehicle could use. We boxed the entire parking area in like a holding pen. Then we chained the panels together, drove steel posts deep into the ground, and locked everything tight. By late afternoon, it was done. 12-foot panels surrounded the lot from every angle. The vehicles inside weren't damaged. Nobody was threatened. Nobody was blocked from reaching their homes. The only thing that changed was this. The people who had parked on my property could no longer drive away from it. As we finished securing the last chain, a woman walking her dog stopped and stared. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked. "Improving property values," I said. Curtis nearly fell over trying not to laugh. By the next morning, my phone looked like it had caught fire. Calls, texts, voicemails, emails, some polite, some furious, a few genuinely creative. Around 8:30, I got my first call from the HOA property manager, a man named Derek Vaughn. His voice carried that familiar tone people use when they think they're still in charge of a situation. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "we've received complaints that you've obstructed access to resident vehicles." "Interesting," I replied. "I've received complaints that your HOA built a fence on my ranch." Silence. A few seconds of it. Then he switched tactics. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding." "No," I said. "A misunderstanding is parking in the wrong spot. This required excavation equipment." He didn't have much to say after that. About an hour later, I emailed the HOA board copies of my deed, the county survey, aerial photographs, tax records, and a polite note explaining that the fence sat entirely on private property. I also attached photos showing dozens of resident vehicles parked on land owned by me. Then I waited. Around lunchtime, things escalated. 3 HOA board members arrived together. Their president, a woman named Karen Whitmore, stepped out first. She looked like she'd been angry for so long she barely remembered any other expression. She marched toward me while I was repairing a gate near the barn. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You're illegally detaining property." I kept working. "Am I?" "Yes, you are." "Interesting." She folded her arms. "You need to remove those barriers immediately." I finally looked up. "And you need to remove your fence immediately." Her face tightened. "That fence was approved by the association." "That's nice," I said. "My deed was approved by the county." For a moment, I thought steam might actually come out of her ears. One of the other board members stepped forward and tried a different approach. "We're willing to discuss this." "Great," I said. "Start by moving the fence." Karen pointed toward the parking lot. "Residents can't access their vehicles." I pointed toward the pasture. "Neither can my cattle." That conversation ended exactly as you'd expect. Nobody got what they wanted. They left angry. I stayed calm. By the end of day one, word had spread through the neighborhood. Some residents were furious at me. Others were furious at the HOA. A surprising number simply wanted to know who thought it was a good idea to build a fence on somebody else's ranch. Tuesday brought new complications. People started missing work. Rideshare drivers arrived only to discover they couldn't reach the trapped vehicles. One resident tried cutting through a section of fencing until he realized tampering with livestock panels on someone else's property was not a brilliant legal strategy. Around noon, Curtis walked into the barn holding his phone. "You need to see this." The story had reached social media. Photos of the white HOA fence were circulating alongside pictures of my steel enclosure. Local community groups were having a field day. Some people called me stubborn. Others called me a hero. One comment simply read, "Never start a land war with a rancher." That one made me laugh harder than it probably should have. By Wednesday, local news crews started showing up. A reporter stood near the property line doing a live segment while a cameraman zoomed in on the trapped vehicles. I tried avoiding interviews, but eventually somebody caught me feeding cattle. "Sir, do you have a comment?" a reporter asked. I shrugged. The cows seemed pretty happy. "What about the HOA? They should probably read surveys before moving fences." The clip aired that evening. Curtis informed me my accidental television career had lasted exactly 11 seconds. Meanwhile, Silver Hollow was falling apart internally. Residents began demanding answers from the board. Why was the fence built without verifying ownership? Why were association funds used for construction? Why had nobody checked county records? Questions turned into arguments. Arguments turned into emergency meetings. Emergency meetings turned into blame shifting. One homeowner later told me board members spent half a meeting accusing each other of whose idea the fence had been in the first place. By Thursday morning, the situation had reached peak absurdity. I was checking water troughs when a black SUV rolled into my driveway. Out stepped a city council member, 2 attorneys, and Karen. The mood was very different this time. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was making threats. They looked tired. The councilman shook my hand. "Mr. Lawson, perhaps we can find a solution." "I've had one since Sunday," I replied. "Move the fence." One attorney cleared his throat. "The association believes there may be room for compromise." "Good," I said. "Compromise starts with acknowledging where the property line actually is." Karen stared at the ground. That was the first moment I realized she knew they'd lost. Completely. The evidence wasn't debatable. The survey was clear. The deed was clear. Even their own contractors had quietly confirmed the mistake. What kept the dispute alive wasn't uncertainty. It was pride. And pride can be an expensive thing when lawyers start billing by the hour. That afternoon, another twist arrived. The county sheriff's office received enough complaints that a deputy was sent to review the situation. Now, if you've watched enough television, this is the part where somebody gets arrested. Real life isn't usually that dramatic. Deputy Harris spent nearly 2 hours examining documents. He reviewed surveys. He checked property maps. He walked the fence line himself. Then he stood beside the HOA board and gave them the answer they desperately didn't want. "Looks like a civil matter," he said. Karen stared at him. "That's it." He shrugged. "It's his property." There was something almost poetic about watching the confidence drain from people who'd spent days assuming authority would solve their problem. The sheriff couldn't help them. The councilman couldn't help them. Public pressure wasn't helping them. The law was very clear, and for the first time all week, they had no choice but to deal with reality. Late that evening, my phone rang again. It was Derek, the property manager. His voice sounded completely different from the first call. The confidence was gone. "The board would like to negotiate," he said quietly. I looked out across the pasture. The sunset was turning everything gold. Beyond the trapped vehicles, I could see the white fence standing exactly where it never should have been. "I'm listening," I said. And for the first time since this whole mess started, the HOA finally began discussing terms instead of making demands. The meeting happened the next morning inside a conference room at a local title company, neutral ground where nobody could pretend facts didn't exist. I brought my surveyor, my attorney, and a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Silver Hollow showed up with their property manager, 2 attorneys, 3 board members, and Karen, who somehow looked 10 years older than she had a week earlier. Funny what stress can do when it's self-inflicted. Nobody wasted time with small talk. One of their attorneys opened by acknowledging that the fence had been installed beyond the community boundary. That might sound like a simple statement, but after days of excuses and arguments, hearing them finally admit it felt like watching a storm break. Then came the real conversation. I laid out my conditions. First, every section of the fence built on my property would be removed at the HOA's expense. Second, the pasture would be restored to its original condition, including reseeding damaged areas and repairing soil compacted by construction equipment. Third, they would compensate me for lost grazing use. Fourth, any future use of the access road would require a written agreement, recorded properly and reviewed by both sides. No assumptions. No shortcuts. No surprises. Karen tried pushing back once. "That seems excessive." My attorney slid a stack of photographs across the table. "So does moving a boundary fence 120 feet onto someone else's ranch." After that, the room got very quiet. The negotiations lasted most of the afternoon, but the outcome was never really in doubt. By 4 o'clock, the documents were signed. Silver Hollow agreed to every major condition. The moment the final signature hit paper, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because the truth is, conflict gets exhausting. Even when you're right. Even when you're winning. For nearly a week, I'd been waking up every morning wondering what new absurdity would arrive before lunch. I was ready for normal life again. The following day, Curtis and I drove out to the parking area. Residents were already gathering near the panels, watching from a distance. Some looked annoyed. Some looked embarrassed. A few actually waved. Over the previous week, plenty of homeowners had learned the board never told them the truth about the land. More than one resident had stopped by to apologize despite having nothing personally to do with the situation. Those conversations reminded me that organizations make decisions, but individuals often end up paying the price. I unlocked the first chain, then the second, then the third. Slowly the steel panels swung open. One by one vehicles rolled out. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Most drivers simply left. The whole thing had gone from neighborhood outrage to public embarrassment, and I think everyone wanted to move on. A few weeks later, construction crews returned. This time they were removing fences instead of building them. They pulled every misplaced post, hauled away every section of vinyl, and restored the boundary to where it should have been from the beginning. By autumn, new grass had started growing across the damaged section of pasture. The cattle didn't care about any of the drama. They never do. Once the grass came back, they went right back to grazing as if none of it had happened. Sometimes I envy that. The HOA eventually rerouted access to their overflow parking through a much longer road on the opposite side of the development. It cost them money. It added travel time. Residents complained. But nobody suggested crossing my property again. That lesson had apparently been learned. Every now and then I still drive past Silver Hollow on my way into town. The white fence is still there. Same color. Same style. Same neat appearance. The only difference is that now it sits exactly on the property line where it belonged all along. And every single time I see it, I remember how quickly confidence disappeared once paperwork entered the conversation. People love talking about property rights until they run into someone willing to defend them. Then suddenly the rules matter again. Looking back, the strangest part wasn't the fence. It wasn't the arguments. It wasn't even the trapped vehicles. The strangest part was how many intelligent adults convinced themselves that ownership could be changed simply because they wanted it changed. Somewhere along the way, a group of people stopped asking whether they had the right to do something and started asking whether they could get away with it. That's a dangerous habit, whether you're running an HOA, a business, or a government. The truth is simple. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. And if you're going to build something on land that doesn't belong to you, you'd better be prepared for the owner to have an opinion about it. Mine just happened to involve livestock panels and a lot full of trapped SUVs. So now I want to hear what you think. Did I go too far? Or did the HOA force the situation by ignoring property rights from the start? If you came home and discovered someone had fenced off part of your land without permission, what would you have done? Let me know down in the comments because these kinds of disputes always seem to divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoy stories about property battles, entitled organizations, and ordinary people standing their ground when nobody expects them to, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who has strong opinions about neighbors, HOAs, and where the line between justice and revenge really belongs.